That pile of dirt is a violation of Covenant 7.4, subsection B, regarding landscape aesthetics. That will be a $500 fine, Mr. Henderson, and I expect it cleared by Friday, or we'll be charging you $100 a day until it is. The woman's voice, a grating mix of saccharine condescension and ironclad authority, sliced through the crisp mountain air. Her name was Karen, and the laminated badge pinned to her floral blouse proudly proclaimed her as the president of the Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association. She stood with her hands on her ample hips, her body a formidable monument to suburban entitlement, planted squarely on the dusty ground between a neatly manicured lawn and the untamed patch of earth I called my own. The pile of dirt in question was a mound of tailings from a test pit I dug the week before, a mix of granitic soil and quartz fragments that sat a good 50 feet from the nearest manicured hedge of her precious development. She was pointing a perfectly manicured finger at it, her face a mask of profound offense, as if my soil had personally insulted her ancestors. This was the third time in a month she had crossed onto my land to lecture me, but it was the first time she'd tried to find me, and the sheer audacity of it left me momentarily speechless. I just looked at her, then at the official-looking violation notice she was holding out, a piece of paper that held all the legal authority of a child's drawing of a dragon. My dragon, however, was real. What do you think? Is there anything more infuriating than someone trying to enforce rules that don't apply to you, on land they don't own? Go ahead and hit that subscribe button, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, or if you've had your own HOA nightmare. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this one ends. Now, where were we? Ah, yes, the $500 fine for my own dirt. I took a slow breath, letting the scent of pine and dry earth fill my lungs, a scent I'd known since I was a boy. This land, this specific 10-acre parcel, wasn't part of Whispering Pines Estates. It never had been. It was the Lucky Strike Lode, a patented mining claim my grandfather, a crusty old prospector with hands like leather and a heart of gold, had filed for back in the 1950s. He'd spent his life chasing color in these hills, and this little piece of ground was his legacy, not for the gold he found, which was minimal, but for the principle of it. It was his, and now it was mine. When the developers bought the surrounding ranch land to build their cookie-cutter McMansions, they had to survey around my claim. It stuck out of their perfect grid like a sore thumb, an island of rugged independence in a sea of beige stucco and HOA-approved rock gardens. I inherited it a few years back, along with my grandfather's old cabin, his handwritten notes, and his fierce belief that a man's property was his kingdom. After 20 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, building things and, more often than not, blowing them up, I'd come back here seeking solitude, a place where the only orders I had to follow were my own. I had no intention of large-scale mining, but I enjoyed prospecting as a hobby, honoring my grandfather's memory by sifting through the same soil he had. The pile of dirt Karen found so offensive was the result of me chasing a small quartz vein, a weekend project that connected me to my roots. I finally broke the silence, my voice calm and even, a tone I'd perfected over years of dealing with far more dangerous situations than an irate HOA president. Karen, I said, not taking the paper, we've been over this. Your authority ends at that line of survey markers. I pointed to the small, almost invisible metal stakes that delineated the edge of her suburban kingdom. This is not Whispering Pines property. This is a federally patented mining claim. Your covenants are as relevant here as a surfboard in the Sahara. Her face, which had been a smug mask of victory, tightened. The condescending smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. Don't be ridiculous, Mr. Henderson. The developer assured us this unkempt area was a designated natural buffer zone. It falls under the association's purview for maintenance and fire prevention. That dirt pile is a fire hazard and an eyesore. It's affecting property values. It was a masterclass in bureaucratic doublespeak. Natural buffer zone was their sanitized term for the weirdo's land we couldn't buy. It's a fire hazard? I asked, gesturing to the mound of mostly sand and rock. It's dirt, Karen. It is literally what you use to put out fires. And as for property values, I'd argue a woman standing on private property trying to illegally find the owner is probably more of a deterrent to potential buyers than a pile of earth. Her eyes narrowed into slits. The floral blouse seemed to strain at the seams as she puffed herself up. I am the president of this association. I am trying to maintain a standard of living for our residents, and your junkyard is a problem. Pay the fine, remove the dirt, or you will hear from our lawyers. She thrust the paper at my chest. I didn't move, and it fluttered to the ground, landing softly on the very dirt it was condemning. The irony was so thick I could have shoveled it. No, I said, my voice losing its patient edge and gaining a flinty hardness. You will be hearing from mine. You are currently trespassing. I'm asking you for the last time to leave my property. For a moment, she looked genuinely shocked that I would dare refuse her royal decree. She opened her mouth, then closed it, a goldfish gasping for procedural water. Finally, she scoffed, a short, ugly sound. Fine, have it your way, but don't say I didn't warn you. She turned on her heel, her orthopedic sandals crunching on the gravelly soil, and marched back toward the pristine asphalt of her domain. As I watched her go, I felt a familiar coldness settle in my gut. It wasn't fear, it was the quiet, methodical focus that came before a complex operation. She thought this was a neighborhood dispute. She thought she was dealing with some non-compliant homeowner. She had no idea that she hadn't just picked a fight. She had declared war on a fortress, and she'd done it while standing on the wrong side of the wall. I looked down at the violation notice lying in the dust, a declaration of hostilities from a petty tyrant. Bending down, I picked it up, folded it neatly, and slipped it into my pocket. It wasn't a fine. It was evidence. I walked back to my grandfather's cabin, a sturdy structure of hand-hewn logs that had stood for 70 years, a testament to building something to last. Inside, the air smelled of old wood, coffee, and gun oil. It was my sanctuary. But that peace was now threatened, not by a storm or a wildfire, but by the creeping pestilence of suburban bureaucracy. Karen's threat about lawyers wasn't idle. I knew that. These HOAs, especially in new, affluent developments, had legal retainers bigger than the budgets of some small towns. They operated on a simple principle: crush dissent through financial attrition. They'd sue you, fine you, and lien your property until you either complied or were forced to sell. But their power, their entire legal framework, was based on the covenants signed by homeowners within their jurisdiction. I had signed nothing. My land was an independent nation, and its borders had just been violated. I pulled out the long, cylindrical tube my grandfather had kept in his old footlocker. The cardboard was soft with age, but the label, written in his elegant cursive, was still clear. Lucky Strike Load, Patent and Assays. I carefully unrolled the contents onto the heavy oak table that dominated the main room. The centerpiece was the land patent itself, a beautiful document from the U.S. Department of the Interior, Bureau of Land Management, dated 1958. It was signed by an official whose name was lost to a flourish of ink, granting my grandfather, his heirs, and his assigns all rights and title to the 10 acres of the claim in perpetuity. It was not a lease, it was not a permit. It was a deed from the United States government, a transfer of ownership as solid as the bedrock beneath my feet. Along with the patent were the original survey maps, brittle and yellowed, showing the claim's boundaries tied to geological markers and official section corners. There were also decades of assay reports, geological notes, and my grandfather's own hand-drawn maps of the tunnels and shafts he'd dug, most of which were now safely collapsed and sealed. This wasn't just a folder of old papers, it was my armory. I spent the rest of the afternoon scanning every document, creating high-resolution digital copies. I saved them to a thumb drive, then uploaded them to a secure cloud server. In the military, we called it building a case file. You start with undeniable facts and build your fortress of logic brick by brick. My first brick was the patent, the second was the survey, the third would be Karen's own foolishness. That evening, I drafted a letter. I kept the language simple, professional, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was addressed to the Whispering Pines Estates HOA, Board of Directors, care of Karen, its president. I stated clearly and concisely that my property, the Lucky Strike Lode, a PN 058-140-22, was not and had never been subject to their CC&Rs, covenants, conditions, and restrictions. I attached a digital copy of the federal land patent and the official survey map showing the claim's boundaries. I informed them that any attempt to find me, lien my property, or enter my land without my express written permission would be met with swift legal action. I cited the relevant state penal codes for trespassing and harassment. I specifically mentioned Karen's unauthorized entry onto my property on that date and included a photograph of the violation notice she had left behind. I finished by formally demanding they cease and desist all communication and actions against me and my property. It was a warning shot, a legal flare sent up to show them they were navigating in dangerous waters. I sent it via certified mail the next morning, requiring a signature upon receipt. I also sent a copy via email to the address listed on their community website, creating a digital paper trail. Now I waited. I knew a person like Karen wouldn't back down easily. Her power was derived from the perception of her authority. To admit she was wrong, that she had no jurisdiction over me, would be to show weakness, and tyrants, even petty ones, cannot afford that. I expected her to double down, to escalate, and honestly, I was counting on it. While I waited for her response, I started phase 2 of my plan. I spent a weekend walking every inch of my property line, using a high-quality GPS unit to verify the old survey markers. They were all there, small brass caps set in concrete, hidden under brush and pine needles. I cleared the area around each one and hammered in a tall wooden stake next to it, tying bright orange flagging tape to the top. My property line was now unmistakably, vibrantly visible from 200 yards away. It was no longer an invisible line on a map. It was a clear, physical declaration. You are here, I am here. Do not cross. This served two purposes. First, it was a visual reminder to Karen and any other resident who might be watching. Second, it would make any future trespass impossible to deny as accidental. It was a line in the sand, drawn with stakes and fluorescent tape. A few days later, the certified mail receipt came back, signed for by Karen herself. The trap was set. The bait was out. All I had to do was wait for the apex predator of the cul-de-sac to make her move. I didn't have to wait long. The official response from the Whispering Pines HOA arrived a week later, not as a contrite apology, but as a thick envelope reeking of self-importance. Inside wasn't a letter from a lawyer, which I had expected, but a much more insulting document. Another violation notice. This one was for unapproved boundary marking, citing a non-existent covenant against stakes, flags, or other unsightly demarcations visible from community property. The original $500 fine for the dirt pile was still there, now augmented by a daily late fee of $100, bringing the total to a ludicrous $1,200. Attached was a new fine for $500 for the survey stakes. The letter, signed by Karen with a flourish that took up half the page, stated that my so-called patent documents were irrelevant. The developer, she wrote, had established a visual and environmental easement over all adjacent properties to maintain the aesthetic harmony of the community. She had conveniently ignored my cease and desist, my legal citations, and the federal document I had provided. This wasn't just doubling down. This was a declaration that her reality superseded the law. It was exactly what I'd hoped for. Her arrogance was writing my legal case for me. But she didn't stop there. The letter concluded with a new threat. If the fines were not paid and all violations, the dirt and the stakes, were not remedied within 10 days, the HOA would place a lien on my property and take all necessary steps to bring the property into compliance, which I interpreted as a threat to have someone come onto my land and do it themselves. The sheer ignorance was breathtaking. You can't place an HOA lien on a property that isn't part of the HOA. It was like trying to give a parking ticket to a boat, but I knew that the clerk at the county recorder's office might not be so discerning. They might just file the paperwork, creating a cloud on my title that would be a nightmare to clear. This was how they bled people dry. I immediately forwarded a copy of the letter to my email archives, the digital file growing fatter with each communication. It was time to find some allies. I knew from casual observation that not everyone in Whispering Pines was a fan of Karen's iron-fisted rule. I'd seen the resentful looks when she'd measure someone's lawn with a tape measure or leave notices about trash cans being left out for more than the allotted 2 hours after pickup. I needed an inside source. My opportunity came that Saturday. I was out front splitting firewood when I saw one of my neighbors, a man in his late 60s named Bob, walking his golden retriever along the street that bordered my property. Bob was a retired Air Force colonel, a quiet, dignified man who always gave me a respectful nod. We chatted a few times about the weather and the price of gas. I watched as he paused, letting his dog sniff around the base of one of my new, brightly flagged survey stakes. He looked up, saw me, and gave me a small, knowing smile. I put down my axe and walked over to the property line. "Morning, Bob," I said. "Morning, Jack," he replied, his eyes twinkling. "Doing a little redecorating? I hear orange is the new beige this season." The dry humor was a welcome change from Karen's vitriol. "Just making things clear," I said, leaning against a pine tree. "Apparently there's some confusion about where Whispering Pines ends and America begins." Bob chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "Yeah, I got the email blast. Karen's holding an emergency town hall tonight. Agenda item number 1, the hostile adjacent landowner. That'd be you." My heart beat a little faster. This was perfect. "Hostile, huh? All I've done is mark my own property and ask to be left alone." "Jack," Bob said, his smile fading, "you have to understand, to someone like Karen, a boundary isn't a line you don't cross. It's a challenge. Your refusal to bow is a direct threat to her authority. She can't stand it." He looked around, then lowered his voice. "Listen, most of us are sick of her. She fine-combed my wife's petunias last month because they were a non-approved shade of pink. We bought here for the views, not to live in a pastel-colored police state, but people are afraid to speak up. She has a little click on the board, and they rubber stamp everything she does. They'll fine you into oblivion if you cross her." "She's trying," I said, showing him the latest notice on my phone. Bob whistled. "A visual and environmental easement? That's a new one. She's getting creative." He shook his head. "Look, Jack, I flew reconnaissance over places I wasn't supposed to be for 20 years. I know a thing or two about contested territory. You've got the high ground here, legally speaking, but she's got the numbers and the neighborhood's checkbook. Be careful." "I will be," I said, "and I appreciate the heads up, Colonel." "Call me Bob," he said, extending a hand over the invisible line. We shook. "I've got your 6. There's a few of us who are fed up. Let me know if you need any internal reconnaissance." He gave me a sly wink. The alliance was starting to form. My lone outpost now had a friendly agent inside the enemy camp. That night, I could see the lights on at the community clubhouse 200 yards away. I imagined Karen standing at a podium, pointing at a map, painting me as a villain, a blight on their suburban dream. I imagined her twisting my polite, legally sound letters into acts of aggression. Let her, I thought. Let her put it all on the record. Let her whip her followers into a frenzy. The higher she climbed on her mountain of self-righteousness, the farther she would have to fall. I had the law, I had the truth, and now I had an ally. The next step was to fortify my legal position beyond any shadow of a doubt. It was time to see a lawyer. Bob's intel was invaluable. Knowing Karen was actively poisoning the well against me confirmed that a passive defense was no longer enough. I needed to move from a defensive posture to an offensive one, legally speaking. On Monday morning, I wasn't chopping wood. I was in the polished downtown office of a man named Marcus Thorne. Thorne was a legend in the county, a land use attorney who looked more like a grizzled rancher than a lawyer. He had a walrus mustache, a booming voice, and a reputation for surgically dismantling arrogant developers and overreaching government agencies. He'd been recommended by a buddy from my unit who'd used him to fight an eminent domain case and won. I laid the entire stack of documents on his massive mahogany desk. My grandfather's patent, the surveys, my correspondence with the HOA, Karen's violation notices, and a timeline of events. He put on a pair of reading glasses, picked up the patent, and fell silent for a full 10 minutes. The only sound in the room was the ticking of a grandfather clock and the faint rustle of ancient paper. Finally, he looked up at me over his glasses, a slow grin spreading under his mustache. "A patented load claim," he rumbled. "Son, you haven't just got a piece of property, you've got a piece of history. This is sovereign ground, deeded out before half the laws in this state were even written. An HOA has as much jurisdiction here as the government of Monaco. He leaned back in his leather chair, which groaned in protest. This visual and environmental easement she's talking about? It's pure fantasy, a fiction. To have an easement on your property, you or your predecessor, in this case your grandfather, would have had to grant it. Did he? My grandfather, I said, would have sooner granted a fox an easement to his henhouse. He hated developers. He called them the stucco locusts. Thorne let out a booming laugh that shook the windows. I like your grandfather, so no easement exists. She's either bluffing or she's been lied to by the developer. Either way, she's committing libel of title by claiming rights she doesn't have. And this lien she's threatening, that's a felony. Filing a fraudulent lien is a serious offense in this state. This was better than I'd hoped. I had assumed I was in the right, but Thorne was telling me Karen was already deep in criminal territory. So what's our next move? I asked. We let her walk deeper into the trap, Thorne said, his eyes gleaming with strategic delight. Her arrogance is our greatest asset. You've sent a cease and desist. She's ignored it. You've provided proof of title. She's dismissed it. Now we document, we prepare, and we wait for her to make the one mistake that's irreversible. He outlined the plan. First, he would file a quiet title action. It was a lawsuit designed to quiet any competing claims to a property and get a court to issue a declaratory judgment that my title was clear and superior to all others. We would name the Whispering Pines HOA as the defendant. This would move the fight from her turf, HOA notices and board meetings, to my turf, a court of law. Second, he would draft a formal notice to the developer of Whispering Pines and their title insurance company, informing them that the HOA they'd created was making illegal claims against a neighboring patented property. This, he explained, was like throwing a grenade into their boardroom. The developer might have cut corners on their initial survey, and the title company that insured all the homes in that development would panic at the thought that the entire subdivision's legal description might be flawed, or worse, that it was adjacent to a landowner they were now in a legal dispute with. This will put immense pressure on Karen from her own side, Thorne said. Her masters will not be happy. Third, and most importantly, was the trap. She threatened to take all necessary steps to bring your property into compliance, he said, tapping Karen's letter. That sounds to me like she's going to hire someone to come onto your land. Your survey stakes make the boundary undeniable. Your cease and desist made your position clear. If she sends so much as a teenager with a rake across that line, it's not just trespassing. Since this is a mining claim, it could be considered unauthorized mineral trespass, which carries very, very heavy penalties. We need to be ready for that. Over the next week, we executed the plan with military precision. Thorne filed the quiet title action. The shockwave was immediate. I got an email from Bob 2 days later. All hell has broken loose, it read. Karen is furious. The board got a letter from some big-shot law firm in the city representing the developer. They are strongly advising the board to stand down. Apparently, the title insurance underwriter for the entire development has threatened to revoke their coverage. I don't think Karen understands what's happening. She just thinks everyone is betraying her. This was the beauty of Thorne's strategy. We weren't just fighting Karen. We were systematically dismantling her power structure from the inside out, using the very corporate entities she relied on. But I knew Karen. Her ego wouldn't allow her to retreat. Being told to stand down by the developer's lawyers would feel like a personal betrayal, a mutiny. It would only make her more determined to prove she was right. So I prepared for the final phase. I purchased and installed several high-definition, motion-activated trail cameras. I placed them discreetly in the trees along my property line, positioned to give a clear, wide-angle view of the boundary I had marked so clearly. They were virtually invisible from the street, but they would capture every blade of grass that crossed the line. I linked them to my phone. I would get an instant alert if anything, or anyone, breached my perimeter. The stage was set, the legal framework was in place, the surveillance was active. All the pieces were on the board, waiting for the queen to make her fatal move. I didn't have to wonder what it would be. In her last letter, she had told me exactly what she was going to do. She was going to clean up my property, and I was going to let her. The pressure cooker was hissing. Bob's reports from inside the HOA were getting more frantic. Karen had apparently called another emergency meeting, this time a closed-door session with just her loyalists on the board. According to Bob's source, a disgruntled board member who was starting to see the writing on the wall, Karen had framed the developer's legal letter not as a warning, but as an act of corporate cowardice. She told them the developer was just trying to avoid a fight, but that they, the homeowners, had a duty to protect their property values. Bob texted me. She's convinced the board to approve a beautification project for the common area buffer zone. She's using HOA funds to hire a landscaping company. My jaw tightened. She was going to do it. Despite the lawsuit, despite the warnings from her own developer, despite every off-ramp I had given her, she was flooring the accelerator and aiming for the cliff. She was using the community's money to fund her own personal vendetta and to commit a felony on their behalf. I immediately called Thorne. "She's taken the bait," I said, and explained what Bob had told me. I could hear the grim satisfaction in Thorne's voice. "Perfect. Do not engage, Jack. Do not warn her again. Let her cross the Rubicon. Your cameras are active?" 24/7 with cloud backup, I confirmed. "Good man. The moment you get an alert that a commercial vehicle has arrived, call me. Then call the sheriff's department. Don't tell the dispatcher it's just a trespass. Tell them there is an active attempt to excavate and remove material from a patented federal mining claim without the owner's consent. Use those exact words. It's a different level of crime. Also, ask for a senior deputy or a detective if possible, not just a patrol car. We need someone who can understand the gravity of the situation." He paused. "And Jack, stay on your property. Stay calm. Let the cameras do the talking. This is the moment of truth." The waiting was the hardest part. For the next 3 days, every time a truck rumbled down the street, my stomach clenched. I checked my camera feeds obsessively. I cleaned my grandfather's old Winchester rifle, not because I intended to use it, but because the methodical process of breaking it down, oiling the parts, and reassembling it was calming. It was a ritual of readiness. Then on Thursday morning it happened. My phone buzzed with a motion alert. I pulled up the live feed from the camera, pointed at the main section of my property line, right where the infamous dirt pile sat. A large white truck was pulling up, the logo on the side reading, "Garcia's Landscaping and Lawn Care." 2 men got out, followed by a smaller truck towing a Bobcat skid steer loader. And right behind them, pulling up in her pristine white Lexus SUV, was Karen. She got out, pointing, directing the workers like a general deploying her troops. My heart was pounding, a slow, heavy drumbeat. This was it. I watched on my screen as the 2 workers, following Karen's imperious gestures, nonchalantly stepped over my property line. They walked right past the bright orange survey stake and began to unwind a tape measure. Karen stood just on her side of the line, arms crossed, a smug, triumphant look on her face. She thought she was being clever, staying off my land while her hired hands did the dirty work. It wouldn't matter. The conspiracy was already in motion, and she was the director. I had my phone in my hand. First, I called Thorne. "They're here," I said. "Bobcat and all." "Excellent," he said coolly. "Make the calls. I'm on my way. It'll take me 30 minutes. Next, I dialed the non-emergency number for the sheriff's department. A calm dispatcher answered. I took a deep breath and recited the words Thorne had given me. "I need to report an active attempt to excavate and remove material from a patented federal mining claim without the owner's consent. My name is Jack Henderson. The address is..." I gave them the details, including the name of the landscaping company on the truck. I emphasized the federal status of the land. "I'd like to request a senior deputy or a detective be dispatched, as this involves federal land patents and potential felonies." There was a pause on the other end. Then the dispatcher's tone shifted from routine to serious. "Okay, Mr. Henderson, stay on the line. I'm dispatching a unit now. Do not confront the individuals. A deputy will be there shortly." I watched my camera feed as the workers started the Bobcat. The engine roared to life, a guttural sound that seemed to violate the morning quiet. Karen took a step back, a pleased smile on her face. The Bobcat driver, a young man who probably had no idea what he was getting into, lowered the bucket and drove straight toward my pile of dirt. He crossed the line. He drove past the stake. The steel bucket dipped down and bit into the earth my grandfather had claimed, the earth that was legally and spiritually mine. The first scoop of dirt, my dirt, was lifted into the air. At that exact moment, a new icon popped up on my phone. A file had been saved to the cloud. The crime was complete, and it was documented in glorious high definition. I felt a cold, dark satisfaction wash over me. She had done it. After all the warnings, she had finally, irrevocably, walked into the trap. Now all I had to do was wait for the jaws to spring shut. I stood by my window, watching, my phone recording the live feed. The bobcat dumped the first load of my dirt into the back of the landscaping truck. They were literally stealing my land, one bucket at a time. And their queen was watching, presiding over the pillage with a serene smile. The smile wouldn't last long. The first to arrive was a single sheriff's patrol car. It rolled up slowly and parked behind Karen's Lexus. A young deputy, looking barely out of his 20s, got out. I recognized him. He was the same one who sometimes sat in his car at the entrance of the development, a friendly presence for the residents. Karen saw him and her smile widened. She strode over to him with the confidence of someone who believed the law was her personal concierge service. I watched on my camera feed, the microphone picking up their conversation, tinny but audible. "Good morning, deputy," she said, her voice dripping with sweetness. "Thank you for coming. We're just having this unsightly public nuisance cleaned up. This man," she gestured vaguely toward my cabin, "has been completely uncooperative." The deputy nodded, looking from the bobcat, which had paused its work, to the pile of dirt, to Karen. "Ma'am, we got a call about something about a mining claim?" He sounded confused, clearly out of his depth. "Oh, that's just some nonsense he's invented," Karen said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "This is a community buffer zone. We have an easement. It's all perfectly legal, I assure you. The HOA board approved it." The deputy looked uncertain. He was caught between a confused dispatch call and the absolute certainty of the HOA president, who likely represented a significant portion of his patrol area's tax base. He was about to make a very bad decision. "Okay, well, can you guys just try to keep it civil?" he said, effectively giving them his blessing. Karen beamed. "Of course, deputy. We'll be done shortly." She turned back to the workers. "Go on, get it finished." The bobcat roared back to life. The deputy started to get back in his car, his job seemingly done. But before his door could close, a second vehicle pulled up, a nondescript black county-issued sedan. A man in a suit and tie got out. He was older, with graying hair and a weary, no-nonsense look about him. This was Detective Miller, the man Thorne had told me to ask for, the department's specialist in property and financial crimes. He walked straight over to the young deputy. "What's going on here, Stevens?" he asked, his voice low but carrying authority. The young deputy's posture straightened immediately. "Sir, just a neighborhood dispute. HOA cleaning up a dirt pile." Miller's eyes scanned the scene, the bobcat on my side of the bright orange stakes, the landscaping truck, the half-full load of my earth, and Karen, who was now looking at him with a hint of irritation, her carefully managed scene now complicated by a superior officer. "A dispute that involves a federal mining patent?" Miller asked, his gaze sharp. Deputy Stevens paled slightly. "Dispatch said something about that, sir, but the HOA president..." "The HOA president doesn't interpret federal land law." Miller cut him off. He turned and walked toward Karen, his expression unreadable. At that same moment, Thorne's car, a big Lincoln, pulled up, and he got out, clutching a leather briefcase. And right behind him, a dark green Ford F-150 with official government plates and a BLM insignia on the door. Two men in the khaki uniforms and body armor of Bureau of Land Management Law Enforcement Rangers got out. The scene had transformed in less than 60 seconds from a minor squabble to a multi-agency federal investigation. Karen's face went through a rapid series of emotions: annoyance, confusion, and then the first flicker of genuine fear. The young deputy looked like he wanted the earth to swallow him whole. The landscaping workers had shut off the bobcat and were standing there, looking terrified. The party was over. I decided it was time to make my appearance. I walked out of my cabin and strolled calmly down to the property line, stopping on my side. All eyes turned to me. I nodded at Detective Miller and the BLM Rangers. Thorne came and stood beside me. "That's him! That's Mr. Henderson!" Karen shrieked, pointing at me as if I were the criminal. "He's the one causing all this trouble." Detective Miller ignored her and addressed me directly. "Are you the owner of this parcel, sir?" "I am," I said. "Jack Henderson. This is the Lucky Strike lode. Patented mining claim number 28-58-0014. And this is my attorney, Marcus Thorne." Thorne stepped forward and handed Miller a folder. "Detective, in this folder you will find a copy of the land patent, the official survey map, and a copy of a quiet title action filed against the Whispering Pines HOA last week. You will also find copies of cease and desist letters sent to the HOA president, Ms. Karen White, which she clearly ignored." Miller took the folder and began to flip through it. One of the BLM Rangers, a tall man with a weathered face and a name tag that read Sutton, walked over to the survey stake, knelt, and examined the brass cap. He pulled out a GPS unit and took a reading. He stood up and looked at his partner. "Boundary is good. The machine is a good 20 feet onto the claim." His partner was already talking into his radio, relaying the information. Karen was sputtering. "This is ridiculous. I have an easement. The developer told me. I am the president." Detective Miller finally looked up from the folder, his eyes cold as ice. He looked at Karen. "Ms. White, are you the one who hired this landscaping company?" "Yes, of course I did. I was authorized by the board to beautify our common area." "And you directed them to enter this property and remove the soil?" Miller asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "I directed them to clean up this public nuisance." "Yes, it's my duty," she said, puffing herself up, still clinging to the wreckage of her authority. Miller turned to the lead BLM Ranger. "Ranger Sutton, what's the charge for unauthorized removal of material from a patented claim?" Sutton didn't hesitate. "Under 43 CFR, subpart 9239, it's willful trespass and damages to public lands, even though it's a private patent. And under state law, since the value of the material and the damage from the heavy equipment will easily exceed $1,000. It's felony theft and felony vandalism. Not to mention the fraudulent lien she was planning to file." Karen's face had gone from pink to a chalky white. The words felony seemed to hang in the air, sucking all the oxygen out of her world. "Felony? That's insane. It's just dirt," she stammered. "It's his dirt," Miller said, pointing at me. "On his land. And you, ma'am, are in a world of trouble." He turned to the young deputy, his voice like cracking ice. "Stevens, go read the landscaping crew their rights. They're material witnesses, for now." Then he looked back at Karen, his face grim. "Karen White, you are under arrest." The moment Detective Miller said the words, "You are under arrest," a profound silence fell over the scene. The only sound was a bird chirping in a distant pine tree, oblivious to the suburban drama unfolding below. Karen just stood there, her mouth slightly agape, her brain apparently unable to process the reality of the situation. The smugness, the entitlement, the sheer force of personality that had been her armor for years. All of it just evaporated, leaving behind a bewildered, middle-aged woman in a floral blouse who had just flown too close to the sun. The young Deputy Stevens, looking mortified but eager to follow a correct order, approached her. "Ma'am, please turn around and place your hands behind your back." It was the look on her face that I will never forget. It was not anger or defiance. It was pure, unadulterated shock. The kind of shock you see in someone who has lived their entire life believing the world operates on one set of rules, only to discover, in a very public and humiliating way, that it does not. "This is a misunderstanding," she stammered, looking past the deputy towards my cabin, as if I could call it all off. "Mr. Henderson, tell them. This is just a silly neighborhood disagreement." I said nothing. I just stood on my side of the line, a silent observer. This was the consequence of her own actions, the inevitable result of her relentless escalation. My silence was my answer. Thorne, however, stepped forward slightly. "My client has been telling you for a month, Ms. White. He told you in person. He told you in writing. He told you with survey stakes. He told you with a lawsuit. You chose not to listen." The deputy gently took her arm. That physical contact seemed to finally break her trance. She let out a squawk of indignation. "Don't you touch me! Do you know who I am?" It was her last pathetic grasp for the status she thought she had. Detective Miller sighed. "We know exactly who you are, Ms. White. You're a woman who hired a crew to commit a felony, and you're about to take a ride downtown." With that, Deputy Stevens professionally and efficiently placed her in handcuffs. The click of the metal ratcheting shut was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. The landscaping crew, two guys who had just been trying to do their job, were being interviewed by the other BLM ranger. They were clearly terrified, but were smart enough to tell the truth. The lady in the Lexus hired them, told them where to park, and pointed at the dirt she wanted gone. Their boss, Mr. Garcia, was on his way, and he was not going to be happy. As Deputy Stevens walked a now sobbing Karen to his patrol car, several neighbors began to emerge from their houses. They'd heard the commotion, seen the official vehicles. They stood on their perfect lawns whispering, their faces a mixture of curiosity and horror. Bob was among them, standing by his mailbox. He caught my eye and gave me a slow, single nod. It was a nod of respect, of vindication. The tyrant had fallen. The fallout was just beginning. Thorne turned to me as the patrol car carrying Karen pulled away. "Phase 1 complete," he said, a grim smile on his face. "Now for Phase 2, the financial reckoning." The BLM Rangers were taking photos, documenting the scene, the tire tracks from the Bobcat, the scoop taken out of my dirt pile. Ranger Sutton walked over to us. "Mr. Henderson, we'll be impounding the Bobcat and the truck with the load of your material as evidence. The U.S. Attorney's Office will likely be in touch regarding the federal charges. On top of that, you have a very strong civil case." "That's my department," Thorne said, clapping the ranger on the shoulder. "Thank you for your prompt response, Ranger." "Our pleasure," Sutton replied with a thin smile. "We don't get many of these, but when we do, we take them very seriously. The integrity of these old patents is a big deal to us." He looked out over my 10 acres of untamed land surrounded by the Sea of Beige. "Glad to see someone still honoring them." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal activity. The HOA was in complete disarray. With their president arrested and their board facing a massive lawsuit, they were headless and terrified. The developer's law firm, which had previously strongly advised them to stand down, now took over entirely, forcing the remaining board members to resign and appointing an interim crisis management team. The first letter I received from their new legal counsel was not a violation notice. It was a groveling apology, begging for a settlement conference. Karen was out on bail, but her life was unraveling. She was facing felony charges, and the HOA's insurance carrier, citing her willful and criminal actions, taken against the explicit advice of counsel, had refused to cover her legal fees. She had to hire her own criminal defense attorney. The community, which she had ruled with an iron fist, had completely turned on her. The people who had feared her now openly scorned her. The hostile adjacent landowner had become the neighborhood liberator. Bob told me the mood in Whispering Pines had changed overnight. People were talking to each other again. Someone had defiantly planted a bed of bright red geraniums, a non-approved color. It was a small act of rebellion, a symbol that the reign of terror was over. My quiet title action sailed through the courts. The HOA, under new management, didn't even contest it. A judge issued a final decree affirming my ownership and declaring that no easements, visual or otherwise, existed or had ever existed. My fortress was now, officially and in the eyes of the highest court in the county, impenetrable. But the civil suit was where the real justice would be served. Thorne was relentless. We sued the HOA for damages, including the cost of the quiet title action, Thorne's legal fees, the cost to repair the land where the Bobcat had driven, and punitive damages for their malicious and willful misconduct. The settlement negotiations were a study in contrast. On one side of the massive conference table sat Marcus Thorne and me. Thorne was in his element, radiating calm, predatory power. I was in my old Army Class A uniform, freshly pressed. I had debated wearing it, but Thorne insisted. "It's a visual statement of character and discipline," he'd said. "Let them see who they were dealing with." On the other side of the table sat a team of 3 lawyers from a high-priced firm in the city, representing the HOA's insurance company and the developer. The interim HOA board president, a shell-shocked accountant who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth, was there as well. Karen was not present. She was a pariah, cast out by the very organization she had once commanded. The lead lawyer, a slick man in an expensive suit, started with an offer that was frankly insulting. He tried to frame the whole incident as an unfortunate misunderstanding caused by an overzealous volunteer. Thorne let him finish his little speech, his face impassive. When the lawyer was done, Thorne didn't even look at his notes. He leaned forward, his voice a low rumble. "A misunderstanding?" he said, his eyes locking with the lawyer's. "My client informed your client's predecessor of his rights. He provided a federal patent. He marked his property line. He filed a lawsuit. In response, your client's predecessor hired a crew, invaded his property, and began to steal his land with heavy machinery. That's not a misunderstanding. That is a pattern of malicious, intentional, and criminal behavior. And we have it all on video." He let that hang in the air for a moment. The other side shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "My client," Thorne continued, gesturing to me, "is a decorated veteran of the United States Army Corps of Engineers. He came here for peace and quiet on the land his grandfather left him. Instead, he was harassed, threatened, and his property was invaded. The emotional distress this has caused is significant, but we are not unreasonable men." He then laid out our demands. It was a masterfully crafted list. First, full reimbursement for all my legal fees and costs associated with the quiet title action and the civil suit. This was non-negotiable. Second, a significant sum for damages. This included the cost of hiring a geological consultant to assess the damage to the claim and a professional crew to restore the land to its original condition. Third, and this was Thorne's masterstroke, was the punitive demand. We didn't ask for just money. We demanded that the HOA pay for the installation of a permanent, high-quality fence along the entire border between my property and their development. A specific type of fence, a handsome, wrought iron-style fence that was both beautiful and utterly permanent. Furthermore, they were to install a large, professionally cast bronze plaque on the fence, right at the main entrance to their community. The wording of the plaque was to be dictated by us. The lawyers on the other side balked. "A plaque? That's unprecedented. It's humiliating." "It is educational," Thorne countered. "It will serve as a permanent reminder to all future HOA boards of the importance of respecting property rights. It will prevent this from ever happening again. It is a condition of settlement. Otherwise, we will see you in court, where a jury will hear about the felony charges, see the videos, and look at my client in his uniform. And I promise you the number they come up with will be far more humiliating than a bronze plaque." They asked for a recess. They were gone for nearly an hour. When they came back, their faces were grim. They had agreed to all our terms. The victory was total. The financial settlement was more than enough to cover everything, with a substantial amount left over for the trouble. But the real victory wasn't the money. It was the fence. It was the plaque. It was the principle. A few weeks later, a professional fencing company arrived. It was not Garcia's Landscaping. This was a high-end outfit. Over the next week, they installed a beautiful, formidable fence along the entire property line. It was black, elegant, and screamed, "Stay out," in the most polite, yet firm way possible. Then came the plaque. It was mounted on a stone pillar built into the fence, right where everyone driving into Whispering Pines would see it. I stood with Bob as the workman finished the installation. He read the text aloud, a huge grin on his face. "This boundary marks the edge of the Lucky Strike lode, a patented mining claim established in 1958. This land is private property and not subject to any HOA covenants or jurisdiction. Trespassers will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." Underneath, in smaller letters, it read, "This fence and monument installed by the Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association, pursuant to civil settlement, case number C-VIFI 202-3987. It was the most beautiful, glorious, and satisfying document I had ever read. It was a monument to the downfall of a petty tyrant, paid for by her own kingdom. As for Karen, her story did not have a happy ending. Faced with irrefutable video evidence and abandoned by the HOA, she took a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of criminal trespass and malicious mischief, avoiding the felony conviction but receiving a hefty fine, 2 years of probation, and court-ordered anger management classes. She was also, as part of her plea, permanently barred from ever serving on an HOA board again. The last I heard, she and her husband had sold their house, at a slight loss, I'm told, and moved away. The cloud of her reign had lifted, and the sun was finally shining on Whispering Pines. The community was better for it. Bob was elected the new HOA president, and his first act was to hold a bonfire where residents could burn their old violation notices. He ran the HOA with common sense and respect, and the neighborhood thrived. And me? I finally had my peace. I sat on the porch of my grandfather's cabin, looking out at my land, now protected by a beautiful fence. The pile of dirt was still there. A little smaller perhaps, but it was my pile of dirt. It was a symbol not of defiance, but of ownership, of legacy. I had honored my grandfather. I had defended my kingdom. And in the process, I had learned that sometimes the most valuable thing you can find on a mining claim isn't gold. It's justice. Life settled into a new, more peaceful rhythm after the storm. The fence stood as a silent, dignified guardian, and the bronze plaque became a minor local landmark. New residents moving into Whispering Pines were told the story, a cautionary tale about the limits of authority and the importance of knowing where your property line is. It served its purpose perfectly. There were no more visits, no more notices, no more challenges. The war was over, and the peace was better than I could have imagined. Bob, true to his word, proved to be an excellent HOA president. He brought a level of calm and reason to the position that had been sorely lacking. The approved color palette for houses was expanded, the rules about petunias were abolished, and the general atmosphere shifted from one of tense surveillance to one of neighborly community. He would often stop by the fence on his evening walks with his dog, and we'd chat. He'd update me on the goings-on in the neighborhood, and I'd tell him about the small flecks of gold I'd find in my sluice box. One evening, he told me something interesting. The HOA's finances, which had been decimated by the lawsuit and Karen's legal adventurism, were slowly recovering. But the developer had taken a massive hit. The title insurance company, having been dragged into the mess, had conducted a full-scale audit of the entire Whispering Pines development. What they found was a surveyor's nightmare. The original survey commissioned by the developer had been sloppy. It wasn't just my property line they'd been fuzzy on. Tiny slivers of land, a few feet here, a few inches there, along the entire perimeter of the development encroached on other adjacent properties, including a large parcel of national forest land. The cost of rectifying these title defects was astronomical. They had to renegotiate boundaries, purchase slivers of land from their neighbors, and refile the legal descriptions for nearly 100 homes. The developer, a faceless corporation from out of state, ended up losing millions. Their reputation in the region was shattered. In a way, Karen's obsession with my little pile of dirt had exposed a systemic rot, and my fight had inadvertently saved the other homeowners from future legal time bombs they never knew were ticking under their manicured lawns. I took a certain grim satisfaction in that. My grandfather's legacy had not only protected itself, but had extended its protection over the very people who had initially viewed it as a blight. My life returned to the simple pursuits that had drawn me back to these hills. I spent my days exploring the old claim, occasionally clearing a bit of brush or digging a new test pit. Every shovelful of dirt felt different now. It was not just earth, it was vindicated territory. It was sovereign soil. I even reopened a small section of one of my grandfather's old horizontal shafts, not for any serious mining, but more as an act of historical preservation. I shored it up with new timbers, ran a line for some simple electric lights, and created a small, safe space inside the mountain where I could sit and feel the profound silence of the rock. It was in that shaft, about 50 feet in, that I found the box. It was an old military surplus ammunition can, tucked away on a high ledge, covered in decades of dust. My grandfather must have put it there long ago. With a sense of reverence, I carried it back to the cabin. The latches were stiff, but they finally gave way with a groan. Inside, it was not filled with gold or precious minerals. It was filled with his journals. Not the geological notebooks I already had, but his personal diaries, filled with his thoughts, his dreams, his struggles. I spent the next several nights reading them by the light of a lantern, a bottle of good whiskey at my side. He wrote about his love for my grandmother, his pride in my father, and his deep, abiding connection to this piece of land. He wrote about the stucco locusts, even back in the 70s, as the first signs of suburban sprawl began to creep up the valley. In an entry from 1978, he wrote something that made me stop cold. The developers are sniffing around the old Johnson Ranch. They'll want my claim. I know it. They see a blemish on their perfect map, but they don't understand. This land isn't just dirt and rock. It's freedom. It's proof that one man, with his own two hands and the law on his side, can hold a piece of the world for himself, a place where he is king. I'll never sell. I hope my boy and his boy after him understands that. This isn't about money. It's about holding the line. I closed the journal, the old leather cover cool beneath my hand. A wave of emotion washed over me. He had known. He had foreseen this exact fight, this exact challenge decades ago. And he had trusted that his legacy would be in the right hands. I had not just defended a piece of property. I had held the line, just as he had hoped. The final piece of the story fell into place a year later. I received a formal-looking letter, not from a lawyer, but from the County Historical Society. A local historian, researching the old mining districts in the area, had come across the court records from my quiet title case. Intrigued, he had dug deeper, pulling the original patent files from the National Archives. My little 10-acre claim, the Lucky Strike lode, was apparently one of the last and best preserved examples of a small-scale lode patent in the entire state. The historian asked if I would be willing to allow them to document the claim for a new book they were writing on the region's mining history. He also asked if I had any family stories or documents to share. I invited him out to the cabin. I showed him the patent, the maps, and the assay reports. Then I showed him my grandfather's journals. He was ecstatic. He spent a week with me, recording my story, photographing the land, and carefully scanning the journals. The book was published the following year. It contained a whole chapter on the Lucky Strike lode, complete with a photo of the cabin, a picture of my grandfather from the 1950s, and a shot of the bronze plaque on the fence. The story of my fight with Karen and the HOA was told in detail, framed as a modern-day example of the age-old conflict between individual liberty and encroaching civilization. My little property dispute had become a piece of local history, a footnote in the story of the West. It was the ultimate vindication. My grandfather's claim was no longer just a parcel on a map. It was immortalized, its story preserved for generations. The dirt pile was gone, naturally reclaimed by the mountain winds and rain. Its purpose served. The fence stood strong. The cabin remained my sanctuary. And in the quiet evenings, as the sun set behind the peaks, I would sometimes walk the fence line, my hand resting on the cool iron, and I would look over at the lights of whispering pines, a kingdom at peace next to my own. I had held the line, and in doing so, I found a wealth far greater than gold. I had found my place, I had found my purpose, and I had ensured that my grandfather's legacy, like the mountains themselves, would endure.